What is reality? Wow, that's one hell of a question. That's the deepest question you're ever going to ask in life. And believe it or not, it is possible to answer this question, although the answer is so radical that it can't be communicated with words. But nevertheless, we're going to try here today. I spent about 15 years of my life racking my mind over this question, trying to figure it out through philosophy, through science, through contemplation, through meditation, through many different means. And really, the reason that I want to shoot this episode is for those of you, I know that there's a few of you, maybe 1 in 100,000 watching and listening, that are just innately curious, and your whole life you've been trying to figure out what the hell is reality. And you've been intuiting that there's something deeper to reality than just what you've been told, what your culture or what science or even what religion has told you, that there's something deeper, something you're missing. And you can't quite put your finger on what it is, but you know there's something there, but you don't know like where to go with it. So today I'm going to tell you exactly what it is, which will help you to then pursue it for yourself. Of course, my words will not be enough, but nevertheless, here we go. Now, of course, the answer is extremely threatening to your life and to your sense of reality, which is precisely why it's so difficult and so rare to answer this question. So, are you sure you want to know? Are you sure you want to know? Because this will change your whole life if you understand what I'm about to say. Here we go. Hold on to your hat. Reality is infinite consciousness, and reality is infinite imagination. But what is consciousness? And how could reality be infinite imagination? Isn't there a physical reality that's not imaginary? Isn't that obvious? Well, be careful what you assume. What I mean by reality being infinite consciousness is that, see, when you were born, or when you imagine that you were born, you had no idea what you were born into. You had no idea who you were, what the world was, what life was, what the point of life was, who your parents were, who other people were, time and space. None of it. You didn't know anything. You didn't even know that you were born, and you didn't even know that you were going to die. You knew nothing at all. You were a blank, ignorant slate, we might say. And then you quickly started learning stuff. And you quickly started misunderstanding what reality is. So now we have to deal with these misunderstandings, which run very, very deep in your subconscious mind. So that's why this conversation is so tricky. This is advanced stuff. This is not your average freshman class. I'm talking about the most advanced things that a human being can ever possibly understand, okay? So stay with me here. Hold your objections. I'll try to answer them as we keep going. So, the key mistake you made when you were born is that you assumed that it's possible for there to be physical objects that exist independently of consciousness. You saw rocks, you saw trees and cars and people, and you just assume, well, I was born into this world, this universe of people, trees, cars, and rocks, and roads, and cities, and so forth, and that's what I was born into. There was like a big bang, billions of years ago, then billions of years passed, stardust congealed, and eventually stars were formed, and then planets were formed, one of which was the Earth, and then millions and billions of years of evolution created life and microbes, and then animals, mammals, and apes, and finally me, and then my parents had sex one day, and there was an egg and a sperm, they met, and then I was born 9 months later, I came out, then I became conscious a few years after that, and so here I am. Well, that's not possible. That's not what reality is. Objects are not possible. Only consciousness is possible. Now you ask, well, Leo, what is consciousness? This right here is consciousness. This present moment, what you're seeing here right now, this is consciousness. This is as close as you get to reality. You're in reality right now. Not only are you in reality, you are reality. But we'll get to that later. So here's what reality is. It's consciousness. The stuff that's happening right here. These are not physical objects. This is something that is being imagined by consciousness. There cannot be rocks and trees and cars and people and atoms and earths and big bangs. There can only be what is held within consciousness. Everything that you have ever experienced has been held in your consciousness, including you, including your physical, what you call your physical body. Take out your hand right now and look at your hand. This hand is not a physical hand. This is consciousness. Your hand is made out of consciousness. Cells and atoms. This is consciousness. It is not possible for there to be atoms and cells and time and space outside of how it is held within consciousness. There is no physical reality and no physical universe. The Big Bang never happened. You are not actually sitting on the planet Earth. Billion years have never passed. There is no space. There is no time. You are not a biological living creature. In fact, you were never even born. You do not have parents. You did not have a childhood. You did not grow up. You did not press play at the beginning of this video. You imagined all of that. Because reality is infinite imagination. Ta-da! You're imagining everything, including yourself, including your physical body, including your birth, all of your memories, your parents, all other human beings, all animals, the entire physical universe, science, religion, spirituality, self-improvement, money, and everything else that you know and love, including your emotions, the highest ones and the lowest ones, pain, suffering, human history, the 21st century. You're imagining all of it right fucking now. And if you're not imagining it right now, it does not exist. And what you are, your truest nature, you are not a biological creature that was born to some mother and father who were hominids that evolved from billions of years of evolution. That is all a backstory that you have imagined. What you really are, your truest nature, that thing that's sitting there right now, conscious of this very moment and this finger pointing at it, that thing is infinite imagination, or what is otherwise known as God. I don't mean the Christian God. I don't mean the Muslim God. I don't mean a bearded man sitting up in the clouds who judges you, who is separate from the universe, who created the universe thousands or millions or billions of years ago. I mean the actual God, you, infinite consciousness, infinite imagination, sitting there the whole time. You have been sitting in this spot eternally, existing, imagining all sorts of dreams and various realms, one of which is this physical human thing you call life. And you're sitting here imagining it right now. And furthermore, you are imagining that you are not imagining it, but that it is real. And because there is no contrast between imagination and reality, because reality doesn't exist, only imagination exists. Whatever you imagine becomes real for you to the point where you mistake it for reality. So you are God dreaming up this world, lost in your own dream until the point where you wake up. You see, this is very radical. You do not want to accept what I'm saying here, and you have a million excuses for why what I'm saying doesn't make sense, and why it is false, and why I'm crazy. But what I'm telling you is the absolute truth. And deep down, you know this. Deep down, all of your excuses and all of your stories and all of your justifications are just something you're imagining. In fact, your denial is something you're imagining, which is precisely how reality gets created. You are the creator of the entire universe. You have infinite creative power. But you don't know how you're doing it. You're not conscious of how you're doing it. Consciousness is a completely empty substance which imagines or holds or conceives of things. In the same way that, let's use the analogy here of a projector, an old-time movie projector which projects light through some transparent film frames, which then gets projected onto a wall, and you have some kind of movie forming. So that's a pretty good analogy. So consciousness is that pure white light which is shining from the projector through various frames to then get you your quote-unquote reality. What you are is that pure white light. That's what is illuminating this whole scene right here, right now. That pure white light is formless and infinite and indistinct. It has no features or qualities whatsoever. You can't grab it in any way. But it is pure consciousness. So, like this movie screen example, this movie projector example, the consciousness has no form to it or shape to it until it is shined through some sort of medium or object, which then gives it distinctions or differences, contrasts in color and intensity. And so the reason I use this metaphor is because actually it's really good, because if you think, for example, as a movie director can set a movie in any time period that he wants. He can shoot a movie in the 21st century. He can shoot a movie about the medieval times. He can shoot a movie about pirates. He can shoot a movie set in the Great Depression. He can shoot a movie 3,000 years into the future, some sci-fi thing. He can shoot a movie about ancient Egypt. Now you might wonder, but how could he do that when he's shooting in the 21st century? But of course, what you don't realize is that the projector doesn't care what century it is. It doesn't know what century it is. The projector is indiscriminate, pure white light. Whatever film frame you put in front of it is what sets the scene and creates the sense of a century. So right now you're sitting here imagining, thinking that you're in the 21st century. You're not. You're imagining the 21st century. And in fact, as infinite consciousness, you're imagining all centuries, all timelines, all beings, all lifetimes simultaneously, of which One of them is this one right now that you're presently conscious of. So you see, a movie director isn't limited to what he can display on the screen. He can literally display anything he can imagine. And then, of course, there's technological limitations. But the beauty of consciousness, infinite consciousness, is that it has no technological limitations. So the one key difference between our projector analogy and the actual reality that we're talking about, what's really going on here right now, is that the pure white light is being shined from some sort of physical projector. I want you to get rid of that notion. Because see, now you have some question about, well, Leo, but where does consciousness come from? How come consciousness comes from some sort of brain or neurons or whatever? No, that's not what consciousness is. You misunderstand what consciousness is. Consciousness is one of the most misunderstood things that human beings know. Science completely misunderstands what consciousness is. Consciousness is not grounded in any substrate. It is the substrate for everything else. Consciousness is not happening in a brain or through neurons or molecules. Consciousness is not happening in time or space. Rather, time and space are being held or imagined by consciousness. Molecules and atoms and neurons and brains are being imagined by consciousness. Your birth is being imagined by consciousness. All of your memories of childhood are being imagined by consciousness. All other people, including your parents and even myself, are being imagined by consciousness right now, which is why I'm here before your eyes. I'm imaginary, as are you. My body is imaginary, as is yours. My body and everything physical that you see around me is just like that film frame going past the projector. And the projector is you, that pure light. Now you might wonder, well, Leo, where does the light come from? What is this light? How do you explain the light? The light is nothing. Literally. It's nothing. It's emptiness. It's pure void. Much like the way that a bowl of rice must be empty to contain the rice. Likewise, the light shining through the frame is empty in order for the frame to fully manifest itself without distortion. Because, if the light was not pure white, but if it was green or yellow or brown or whatever, that would interfere with the frame that we want to display, so to speak. So consciousness is actually nothing. It's completely indistinct. It has no differences, no contrast within it. Therefore, you cannot pinpoint it or grab it in any way. It's not localized. It's not in time and space. It's pure, infinite, eternal consciousness. That's what's being conscious of this very moment in you right now. That's the thing that's been there your entire life. So it's nothing, but then what consciousness can do is consciousness can create differences within itself. How does consciousness create differences within itself? Well, this is where the God part comes in. You see, consciousness is absolutely infinite. It's unlimited. People don't appreciate what unlimited means. An unlimited thing has absolutely no limits to it, which means that it can do literally anything. It is not constrained by any rules or laws. Because rules and laws and constraints and limits are what it imagined. So the mistake that people make is they think, well, because I live in this limited physical world and I can't do things like flap my arms and fly or jump and land on the moon and various other sorts of things that you can't do within this physical reality, that they assume that consciousness is also limited in this way and that the whole universe is limited. But it isn't. This universe that you're in right now is something you're imagining, and all of the limitations of it are something you're imagining. But pure infinite imagination, prior to imagining any limits, has no limits whatsoever. Now, why is this the case? This is the case because of non-duality, because of oneness. It's impossible to actually draw a boundary between any two objects in the universe, because any boundary or object is imaginary. So everything becomes one. When everything is one, reality being one, there's nothing outside of it to limit it or constrain it or to tell it how to be. Therefore, it must be unlimited. Anything outside of reality is actually inside of reality, because that's what reality is. Reality is everything that is. So if you can imagine something outside of everything that is, you haven't imagined everything that is, because everything that is must include that thing outside which you have left out. It's total. It's infinite. When I say infinite, by the way, I don't just mean infinite in physical 3 dimensions. That's not what I mean. The physical 3 dimensions are occurring within infinite consciousness. Infinite is a much broader notion than physical space or time or anything like that. It's not just a measure of size. When I say that consciousness or reality is infinite, I'm not just saying that the universe stretches on forever and it's infinitely big. Of course, that is part of what I'm saying, but I'm saying much more. I'm saying something more radical than that. I'm not just talking about physical infinity. I'm talking about actual infinity. Infinity in, in all possible ways. So when you realize that reality must be totally infinite because it's one, you realize that nothing constrains it. That means it's all powerful, infinitely intelligent, and it can manifest immediately anything that it wants. You might wonder, well, Leo, how can it do that? That's impossible. No, remember, possible and impossible are something infinite consciousness, is imagining. Everything you think is impossible is actually imaginary. You had to imagine it first for it to exist as an impossibility or a possibility. In fact, you're imagining the difference between possible and impossible. You're also imagining the difference between real and imaginary. You're also imagining the difference between how. So when you say, well, Leo, how can this be possible? This seems outlandish and magical and science fictional. You're making a mistake again. How is something you're imagining. Prior to imagining how, there is no how, which means that everything is possible without a how. As unbelievable as that may sound. And of course, everything I say here is extremely unbelievable. But nevertheless, it's absolutely true, which makes it all the more amazing. Reality is no how, no where, no when, no what. Because how, when, where, and what are all imaginary, and they must be imagined first for them to exist. So what consciousness does is it imagines differences. Everything in reality that you know is a difference. The fundamental building block of reality, contrary to what science has taught you, is not molecules or atoms or quarks or strings. Reality is not a digital computer simulation, which is a popular idea that's thrown around these days by philosophers and scientists and techno geeks. Reality is none of that. Reality is made out of differences. Reality is not energy. It is not information. It is not bits. It is none of that. It is differences. So what is a molecule? It's a difference. What is a cat? It's a difference. What is a tree? It's a difference. What is a string? It's a difference. What is a bit, a 0 and a 1? It's a difference. Everything is difference. The only reason you can tell this hand from this hand is because they're different. If this wasn't different from this, they would actually be one. Science doesn't understand any of what I'm saying here, so we're way beyond science. So if you're trying to use science as some sort of reference point for understanding what I'm trying to say, you're way off. It's not going to work. Science is imaginary. Religion is imaginary. Everything you know is imaginary. Now let's address some of your biggest concerns here about imagination. Because when I say imaginary, I'm of course using that word in a much different and broader sense than the way conventionally people think of imagination. Most people limit imagination to just images in the mind and thoughts. Now, of course, that is imagination, but that's just a very limited human version of imagination. What I'm saying is that right now, this hand before my eyes and your eyes is imaginary. I'm imagining this hand, and so are you. Now you say, well, Leo, how can this possibly be? If I was imagining this hand, then I could imagine that it's something else, and then it should turn into that, shouldn't it? Remember that there's a lot you're not conscious of. Remember that you are capable of many orders and states of consciousness, which are far beyond the state of consciousness that you're in right now. So right now, in conventional, ordinary human consciousness, you're right, you can't understand this hand to be imaginary. But when you become more conscious, much more conscious, many orders of magnitude more conscious, 1,000,000 times more conscious than you are right now, which is possible to do, then you will realize that your hand is imaginary. No different than the thought of a unicorn in your mind, or the thought of your parents, or the thought of your birth, or the thought of your death. All of that is imaginary. In fact, everything, all of physical reality is imaginary. So the thing you have to understand about imagination is that there are layers to it. It's not as simple and stupid as you would think. Like, oh, well, Leo, if everything's imaginary, that means I can just think whatever I want. I can just go jump off a cliff and I'll be able to fly because it's just imaginary. Don't straw man me like that. I'm telling you something extremely sophisticated. I'm telling you that imagination is creating all of physical reality. This is not a simple mechanism. This is extremely complicated and nuanced. And there are many layers of self-deception within your own mind that you are imagining right now that you can't even understand what I'm saying. That's how powerful imagination is. It'll take you decades of work to be able to understand the things that I'm saying here. For now, you can just take my word for it. But with work, you can directly realize the things I'm saying are true. You know, we got to start somewhere here, so give me a little bit of room. Give me a little leeway here, a little breathing room to explain this stuff. It's so radical, you see, it's so radical. Because your whole sense of self is wrapped up in being able to understand what reality is. See, conventionally, we think of like reality is over here, this separate thing, and then my sense of self is over here. And you just assume that the sense of self is a given. You assume that you're a biological living creature and that you're physical and that you are the body and that the reality, that's some separate thing from you. What you don't realize is that all of this is deeply intertwined like this in your mind. And in fact, there is no boundary between your mind and physical reality. These are intimately interconnected if you would just question them deeply enough. So here I want to introduce a little explanatory metaphor that will help you understand why it's so difficult to understand these things. Because you see, if you weren't physically born, which is my claim, if you imagined yourself into existence, that means that you have to maintain that image or that imagination. Otherwise, if you stop imagining it, you'll go poof. What will be left of you? So you see, imagine a slope like this. This is the slope we're going to call the slope of reality. When you're born, you start at the very bottom of this slope. There is no reality when you're born. You're born as nothing into nothing. Like I said earlier, you don't even know you were born. You don't even know you're a human. You don't even know who your parents are. You know nothing. But then, quickly, because you need to keep surviving, you start to learn. You learn about yourself. You look in the mirror. You realize you have a face and your body. You learn about pain and suffering, and you learn about your parents, and you learn about friends and school, and blah, blah, blah. And quickly, you learn a lot of stuff. As you're doing that, what you're doing is you think that what you're doing is that you're just exploring the physical world as it's given to you, as it was before you were born. That is not what's actually happening. What's actually happening is that you're inventing the entire universe, including, and of course, starting with yourself, your physical self, your psychological self, your biological self. All of this you had to invent. There is no biology or psychology or physics. You invented them. And all the science that backs it up. So see, what you have in your mind is you have elaborate networks and webs of explanation for what reality is. And they're woven together like a tapestry like this, each one reinforcing the other, creating a sense of solidity. And so now what I'm helping you to do is to pull those threads of the tapestry apart. It's very difficult to do, though, because as we're pulling on one, the other one constricts it and tries to pull it back. It's a tight web. So we have to question it from all sides simultaneously. And of course, you have to be very open-minded to this questioning. Otherwise, forget it. You will never understand what I'm trying to say here. So what's happening through your childhood and teenage years is that you're rolling your way up like a snowball, like a reverse snowball going uphill. You're accumulating more and more snow and getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, growing your sense of self and reality. You're imagining this entire process. This is all a work of God's imagination. But you don't know that. You think you're actually in a physical world as a physical self. But still, you suspect that something weird is going on because reality still seems mysterious, and the explanations that science and religion gives you still never quite make sense. That's right, because you're noticing glitches in your own tapestry and understanding of the world, because it's all imaginary. You're starting to suspect it, but you don't just know how deep it goes yet. So the problem is that now, by this point in your life that I'm speaking to you, you've already built up so much stuff. You have so much to lose. You have a career, you have a business, you have a religion, you have a money situation, you have a relationship, you have a family, you have children, you have blah, 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 right? You have a whole worldview, you have a scientific view, whatever. You have so much stuff that now to undo all that, to question that, that's very difficult. And you're very attached to that. And in truth, you don't care about what reality is. What you care about is the survival of this giant ball of imagination that you created. So now, as we're starting to question, what's starting to happen is that this process is getting reversed. the ball is starting to roll back down the hill. And this slope, you start to quickly realize as you start to question your whole existence, is very, very slippery and very dangerous. And it's precisely for this reason that so few people ever question their existence or reality very deeply. If you haven't noticed, most people just accept what society tells them, accept what science or religion tells them, and they just think that's it. They've got it figured out. It never occurs to them to question the metaphysics of what they think reality is. So as you start to do that, you start to slide down this slippery slope, and quickly your slippage accelerates to the point where now you hit a certain point where you get a little scared. Now it gets a little too real, because as you start to seriously entertain the things that I'm saying here, for example, that your birth is imaginary, or that your memories are imaginary, or that your parents are imaginary, and so forth, now it's no longer a philosophical exercise. This is not a piece of entertainment. This is not just you browsing through some YouTube videos or through some podcasts and listening to cool stuff or science fiction. Now you start to see that your sense of reality has been intimately interconnected with your entire sense of existence itself. And you start to feel yourself unravel. And of course, all of your emotions kick in to overdrive to warn you. Red warning alarms are sounding in your mind, telling you, do not listen to this anymore. Turn it off, turn away, go do something else, distract yourself, forget about it. But that fear is precisely the thing that tells you that what I'm saying is true. You can't deny that fear. That fear of self-annihilation, that fear of losing your whole life in reality, the fear of admitting that everything in your entire life has always been imagination. This is way too radical for you to accept. If you were to fully accept what I'm saying here, and not just to accept it, but to become fully conscious of it, you would have a mental collapse. Some people would call this a psychotic collapse, to the point where you would not be able to distinguish anymore what is real from what is fantasy. You literally would not know that your hand is real anymore. You literally would look into your mother's eyes and you would not be able to distinguish yourself from your mother. This is where it gets really real. And by this point, long before people get to this point, they have already stopped the inquiry. They have no desire to go this far, because they weren't seriously interested in knowing what reality is. They just were screwing around. But a few of us were interested enough that we're willing to go all the way. And so we do. And eventually, when we question deeply enough, we realize that we are inventing ourselves. You have been sitting here, right here, for eternity, imagining stuff. I'm not saying that you imagined your birth back when you were a toddler, or that you imagined your parents back then. I'm saying something more radical than that. You are imagining your entire childhood right now. None of it ever happened, other than in your imagination. Now, of course, you say, Leo, no, that's crazy. That can't be possible. I know it happened. I feel it. I know my parents are real. What kind of nonsense are you trying to pull over my eyes? Yeah, you're imagining that right now. You are imagining right now that your memories and your parents are not imaginary, but that they're actually real. Are you getting this? All of your denials are themselves imaginary. That is the power of infinite imagination. See, you might wonder, well, Leo, if I have infinite imagination, why can't I just imagine some new world right now? I can't do that. I don't have the power to do that. What are you talking about? But you see, that's because you're so busy imagining this physical world. So to imagine a new physical world, you'd have to stop imagining this one. But if you stopped imagining this one and you stopped imagining that you were human, what would happen to you? You would be dead. You've labeled that death. So see, your own imagination is interfering with your own imagination. That's the problem. There, like I said, are deeper and deeper layers of imagination. So right now, while you might be able to imagine a unicorn, that's at a sort of a shallow surface level of imagination. There are deeper layers of imagination at the subconscious level, which are operating right now, which are actually creating this entire physical room that you're sitting in. You can't just stop imagining that, because where would you fucking be? You would think you've gone insane if you could do that. You would be dead. Actually dead. So be careful what you wish for. You have to see how your own ideas and expectations are interfering or creating conflicts between themselves. You see, infinite imagination is a hell of a thing. What infinite imagination means is that you can imagine absolutely anything without any limitations. But once you imagine it, that's what is real for you. What this means is that it's possible for you to imagine that you are in a room somewhere, on some planet, in some galaxy, in some universe at some particular time, and then you will be there, but you will be locked into that if you imagine that what you're imagining is not imaginary, but that it's real, which is exactly what you're doing right now. You see, don't underestimate the power of imagination. It's absolutely total. You're just not conscious yet of all the deeper layers. You can become conscious of them. Make sure that you don't misunderstand me. I'm not playing word games with you. This is not merely some semantic differences of me calling a hand imaginary rather than physical, and that all it is just a word game. No. I'm talking about something very radical here. I'm talking about realizing that this entire room is imaginary to the point where the floor under your feet will melt and you will fall through it, if you still have a body left at this point. See? If you were to suddenly understand everything that I'm talking about, you would think you've had a psychotic breakdown. And many people would react that way. Of course, there's a fine line between awakening and a psychotic breakdown. So they're not quite the same thing, but hey, it's easy to conflate the two. Because literally what happens is that you stop being able to distinguish reality from imagination. And this scares people. This is very scary. It's just fun and interesting when you're just listening to it, but when you actually are unable to tell the difference between what's real and imaginary, when you are no longer able to trust your own memories, and you're not even able to trust your own parents as being real, that's when stuff gets difficult. That's when you start to encounter what they call the dark night of the soul. See, you start to reevaluate everything. You start to question everything. Because as it turns out, your entire life was a fiction. And you've been misunderstanding and misinterpreting your very own life since the very beginning. So, like I said, you have existed here as that pure white light, as consciousness, as empty consciousness, for eternity. Not for a decade, not for 100 years, Not for 1,000 years, not for 1,000,000 years, not for 1,000,000,000 years, not for 1,000,000,000,000 years. Forever. You've been sitting here forever, imagining life after life after life after life after life without beginning and without end. That's what infinite consciousness means. There cannot be anything outside of consciousness. You might question this. You might say, well, Leo, no, that's wrong. Shouldn't we be open-minded that there might be something beyond consciousness? I mean, I get you, Leo, sure. Maybe consciousness is a very important aspect of reality. I'll grant you that, Leo. But what if there's something beyond consciousness? Let's leave our minds open to that. No. If you're thinking this way, then you're not actually conscious of what consciousness is. There is absolutely nothing outside of consciousness. Anything that can be has to be conceived by consciousness. Now you might say, Leo, what's the argument for that? Leo, this sounds like a tautology. It sounds like it's only true by definition. Yeah, that's exactly right. It's true by definition. Truth is true by definition. Truth is inevitable. Reality is inevitable. It has no opposite and it has no alternative. It's absolute. Consciousness is an absolute, and there is nothing outside of consciousness. Anything you can imagine outside of consciousness is actually within consciousness. But you have to be conscious of that. Nothing in your life has ever occurred outside of consciousness. Notice that. Anything you imagine that's outside of consciousness is actually inside of your consciousness right now. You're just misunderstanding what it is. Even non-existence is occurring within consciousness. You might think non-existence is something that's beyond consciousness. No, non-existence doesn't actually exist. Non-existence is something you're imagining within consciousness right now. Consciousness itself is eternal. It can't die. It was never born. And it can't go anywhere. Why can't consciousness go anywhere? Because places and aware is something that consciousness is imagining. Consciousness imagines all locations in space and time, so it can't be anywhere else but where it is. Therefore, it has nowhere to go, making it eternal. You can't destroy consciousness because it's already nothing. Destruction is actually something that consciousness imagines. All forms can be destroyed, but the formless cannot be destroyed, which is what consciousness is. It's the formless. If you still insist that there could be something outside of consciousness, understand this. Inside and outside are something that consciousness conceives, something you imagine. There is no inside or outside. You imagine there is. Consciousness is primary. Consciousness is fundamental. Consciousness is what imagines everything. Which explains why you are at the center of reality. Have you noticed that yet? Isn't it weird? Haven't you been puzzled by this? That no matter where you go, you're at the very center of wherever you are? Why is it that the whole universe seems to revolve around you? It's not because you're a biological creature and that this is like your visual field generated by your brain. No. You're imagining all that. The real reason that you are at the center of the universe is because you're God and because you're imagining everything around you. You see? Now you might object, but Leo, What nonsense are you talking about? What about like if you go and walk off a cliff and then you're going to die? That's not imaginary. That's actually going to hurt you and kill you. How can you say that death is imaginary? We've seen people die. There's nothing imaginary about it. That's you imagining right now death. Well, yeah, Leo, sure, yeah, I'm imagining death right now, but what about actual death? I'm not imagining that. Yes, you are. You're imagining it right now. No, but Leo, what about like if you literally step off a cliff? Aren't you going to die? I mean, you're not going to be alive after that, are you? You're imagining that. And if you actually do go up to a cliff, let's say the Grand Canyon, and you step off, sure, you're going to fall. And you're going to splat your skull on the rocks. And there will be not much left of you, but goo. That's right. But that whole process is imagination within imagination. You see, the cliff you're standing on when you're at the edge of the cliff is imaginary. Your body and feet are imaginary. Your sense of self, your biological, psychological self that you think you are, that went to school and had parents and was born, that whole thing is imaginary. You now falling through the sky towards the rocks, that's all imaginary. And the moment that your skull hits the rocks and gets cracked open and you experience excruciating pain and suffering, all of that will be imaginary. And then when you get lights out, all of that will be imaginary. Just like in a dream. None of this should be impossible for you because you do it in your dreams every night. Now, of course, there's one little extra wrinkle about that you don't yet understand, is that sleeping is imaginary too. You've never actually slept a day in your life. You've only imagined that you have. You're doing all of it right now. Right now. But this is all so radical and goes so completely against your direct experience of life that you can't accept it. Nor should you just blindly believe me. That's not my objective here. My objective here is to make you aware of how you're tricking your own self. Your own mind is deceiving you. Your current state of consciousness is deceiving you. See, there is nothing in reality but states of consciousness. One of which is the one you're in right now. You're in a rather limited state of consciousness right now. There are much more advanced, elevated, expanded states of consciousness in which you can realize all the things that I'm saying, but you're not in those states of consciousness right now, nor have you probably ever been in your whole life. Or maybe you have. Maybe you've had a mystical experience here or there through meditation, through psychedelics, or something like that. In which case, you're a little bit more open to the things I'm talking about. And the things I'm talking about are helping you to make sense of various kinds of mystical things you've experienced, various spiritual phenomena that maybe left you scratching your head, unable to explain. That's right, because you were trying to explain them from a materialist paradigm, which is pure fantasy. So you can't explain it through materialism. You can't explain it as brain states. Make sure you don't misunderstand me. When I say infinite consciousness, there is no brain. You don't have a brain. You imagine your brain. Consciousness does not need a brain. You might say, well, Leo, how could it be possible for there to be consciousness without a brain? Remember, possible and impossible is something you're imagining. Consciousness imagines the brain, not the other way around. Have you had enough yet? It's very radical, isn't it? Yeah, it's absurdly radical. You have to question your entire tapestry of understanding, your entire worldview. And this is very difficult to do because, like I said, each fiber of the tapestry reinforces the others. Most people are only willing to admit some of these things, but not all of them simultaneously at once. Because like I said, you would have a mental breakdown if you did it too fast. It usually takes years to gradually unravel this tapestry. And even then, you will have some very difficult times. If you've taken some psychedelics, then you're a little bit more open-minded to the things I'm saying. That's because what a psychedelic does is it elevates your state of consciousness to the point where your consciousness becomes fluid enough. Usually it's in a very crystallized form. It becomes more fluid to the point where you start to see that boundary between imagination and physicality start to melt away. You take enough LSD, you start to see the walls melting. The walls of your house start to melt. Your hands start to grow eyes on them, looking back at you. What is that about? That's not just hallucination. This is a mistake that people make. When a materialist takes some psychedelics, the psychedelics elevate his consciousness, which starts to make him slide down that slope of reality. But this is so radical and threatening to the ego, he gets scared. And so what he does is he invents stories now to reground his reality and move back up the ramp of reality. See, because he doesn't want to lose himself. I've actually seen this happen. I've had friends who I've seen trip. And I've seen them as their sense of reality is dissolving, they come back from the trip and they say, I remember one friend told me very distinctly, he said, "Oh man, Leo, that was amazing. I was experiencing this infinite love and it was wonderful, but also like I was almost about to lose myself. I was about to die. Like I barely hung in there, man. Wow. Whew. I survived. I can't believe it. That was crazy. I just made it by the skin of my teeth." And I'm sitting there laughing to myself because I know that he didn't actually go all the way down. So he was too scared. He tricked himself into thinking that he somehow needed to physically survive this process. No, you were supposed to die. That's the wrong assumption you made. See, when you take LSD, the walls will start to melt, and you will see eyes on your fingertips, for example. You might imagine that there are eyes on your fingertips, and you will literally start to see them there. Take an even higher dose of LSD, you might look at a car, imagine that it's a goat, and you might actually start to see a goat rather than a car. You need to take a lot of LSD to have it work that way. But this is indeed what happens. Why is it that this happens? Hallucinations? Chemicals in the brain? No. What's really going on is that your consciousness is being elevated to infinite levels, to the point where the boundary between reality and imagination is completely dissolving, and literally you have control over physical manifestation. What you imagine starts to become real. The problem, though, is that you are in such a radically transformed state of consciousness that you don't even recognize that you're a human being anymore at this point. You might not be able to see 2 feet in front of your face, because that's how radically different your state of consciousness is. See? There are some psychedelics that are so powerful that they're actually dangerous to take. Not LSD or mushrooms. They're not dangerous per se if you use them responsibly. But Datura is one example. And even though I'm using this example here, I want to caution you to never use Datura. It's a lethal poison. It can easily kill you. It's also one of the most powerful psychedelics on the planet. It's even more powerful than 5-MeO-DMT because Datura is a powerful deliriant, and it causes total hallucinations, a complete inability to distinguish hallucination from reality. Usually when you take a psychedelic like LSD or mushrooms or even 5-MeO-DMT, you know that you took a psychedelic. Even when you're at the peak of your trip, you know you're tripping. You know you'll come back down. You know you're a human being still, mostly. But on Datura, you don't know. You trip so hard, you don't even know that you took Datura. you forget because your memories are imaginary. On Datura, you can have conversations with friends that you knew from high school, and you can sit there for 2 hours having a conversation with this good friend of yours from high school, only to realize 2 hours later that you never even knew this person and that this person never even was in your room. You were just talking to the wall, but you were hallucinating an entire human being with whom you had an intelligent conversation. Now, people say, well, Leo, that's pretty crazy. That's pretty far out there, but man, all that shows is that it's hallucinations. No, you misunderstand. I am that hallucination right now for you. You are hallucinating my entire body and voice. I am just your own mind talking to you. You're hallucinating me right now. You hallucinated all my videos. But see, you're just not conscious of it. And more importantly, you're not willing to admit it because of the ramifications this would have for life. This would stop your life dead in its tracks if you fully understood what is being said here. It's way too radical. But nevertheless, this is the case. I warned you at the beginning. Do you really want to know what reality is? This is the highest teaching. I'm giving you my highest teaching. It took me over 15 years of reading, studying, thousands of hours of contemplation, meditation, going to retreats, doing powerful psychedelics, racking my mind to understand all of this, to figure it out. This is my highest teaching. Number one, you are God. And there is nothing but God, and you are all alone. That's number one. Number two, everything is imaginary. There is nothing but imagination. God is infinite consciousness. It is infinitely intelligent, infinitely powerful, unlimited. Also, it's infinitely good and it's infinitely loving. But those are aspects which I'll leave out of this discussion. These are the highest teachings. This explains everything. Now your job is to make it actual. Not a story, not a belief, not an ideology, not some new age cult philosophy. Make it actual. Become conscious of it. You can, and the reason you can is because consciousness is all there is. And consciousness is infinite, and you are God. So if you can't do it, who can? You see? How does God realize that he is God? There needs to be some moment of epiphany, even for God, to realize, oh yeah, I'm God. I'm all powerful. I'm pure imagination. I'm infinite. That moment for God is precisely that moment for you. When you become conscious of it, God will become conscious of it because, well, you are God. Yeah, truth is a difficult thing, which helps to explain why people generally don't care very much about truth. They don't pursue truth. They don't teach truth. People are engaged in fictions, stories, lies, manipulations, deceptions. Why? Because the truth is very, very radical and you have much to lose. But don't get depressed, because even though it might sound like what I'm saying here is nihilistic and solipsistic and negative and terrible, it only seems that way to your ego. You're only imagining that it's terrible. the most remarkable thing you'll discover at the end of this whole journey, when you slide off this slope all the way to the bottom, what you will discover is that you go into a free fall where you keep falling and falling and falling, expecting to hit the ground. But what you discover is that there is no ground, so you just keep falling forever. And to fall forever in an infinite space with no bottom and no top and no end and no beginning is to be stationary. It's to be eternal. And this is the discovery of nirvana or paradise. When you fall off this slope completely and you surrender your entire life, and you realize that everything is imaginary, what you also discover is that all of your problems are imaginary, death is imaginary, pain is imaginary, suffering is imaginary, all emotions are imaginary. And so, when you realize all this, you literally enter paradise. Paradise. Actual, literal paradise. This is not a physical realm with palm trees and coconuts and pina coladas and big-breasted women waving at you with palm fronds and feeding you grapes with their hands. This is not paradise. Paradise is right here, right now, this very present moment, but realizing it to be eternal, infinite, absolutely good. Good with no opposite. Why is it good with no opposite? Why isn't it evil or bad? When there is no death, and there is no pain, and there is no suffering, and there is no fear, because you're so conscious that you realize that you're imagining all those, what can possibly hurt you? What can possibly bother you? What can possibly make you upset? What can possibly make you disturbed? You are, at this point, in infinite peace. You're dead. And in this death, you realize immortality. And you literally become immortal. God is eternal and immortal. And in this, you discover infinite love and infinite goodness. And you become so omniscient that you become conscious of how you have designed the entire universe. And you realize the beauty and the goodness behind your own creation. And you have infinite love for yourself and for all of creation. That is what reality is. And I wish that at least one of you watching this or listening to this will one day, 1 in a million of you, will go all the way to the very bottom and realize the truth of everything that's been said here. But also understand that if and when you ever get there, you will be all alone as God. You will not be able to come to me for advice or for support, because you will know that I am you, that I am just a projection and imagination of your own mind. So you will bask in your own beauty and infinitude in that nirvana by yourself. And you will just have to sit there and bask in your own infinite beauty. And that will be my wish for you fulfilled. That will be full awakening. And then you will finally understand what reality is. The magnitude of what reality is. The magnitude of infinite consciousness. And how all of it got created. Wow. That's a hell of a thing to understand. I hope one day you do. That's it. I'm done here. Please click the like button for me and come check out Actualized.org. That's my website. You'll find my blog, my book list, the Life Purpose course, and the forum. The last thing I'll say is that my teachings have to change after some of the things I've realized recently. You know, I can't really go back to teaching the old material as much as I still want to cover a lot of old stuff. A central part of my teaching is going to be that everything is imaginary. This will be too radical of a teaching for many people. Most people are not ready to hear such a teaching. But nevertheless, this is the most powerful teaching that there is. And in fact, this teaching cuts through a lot of even spiritual bullshit that you hear out there and get from gurus and so forth. Many of these gurus are still stuck in imagination. They still don't fully understand that everything is imaginary. Understand that this is the most radical stuff that can be talked about. So I empathize with you if you think that I'm crazy or deluded, or if this is too much for you, or if this seems impractical for you. I understand. I wouldn't have believed or understood any of this even just a few years ago. It's extremely radical, and I've reached levels of consciousness at this point that I don't know how many human beings have ever reached. And so I'm just, I'm just sharing with you what I discovered. And of course, we'll be covering more practical topics in the future as well. But this is a very important episode. Make sure you watch this one a couple of times and you really think through it and go through all of your objections and doubts and concerns, and make sure you realize that they're all imaginary. Because I'll be referencing this point about imagination and the fact that you are God imagining everything many, many times in the future. It's sort of the Archimedean point that we will be using to leverage all of our future work. And of course, as always, stay tuned for more, because there's much more to say.